together that page. There must be some rhyming at some reason.
All right, there's our outline. This is, we're in section F, Mythos and Logos of chapter 4. This is Ancient Civilizations. This is a chapter in philosopher Kenneth Smith's forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm, which he wrote at the turn of the millennium as a series of columns called End Times at the back of the Comics Journal for a good year or two running. And the philosophical project here is an exercise in learning to see the world from multiple perspectives, which is harder than it seems. And the framework for doing so is to get to know the ancient perspective, to get to know the medieval perspective, and then to use those to triangulate to try to figure out what the modern perspective is. Not what the modern perspective thinks it is, what we all think our perspective is, which is, of course, we think we're the bestest people ever. We're the most advanced, the most scientific, the most objective, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. We just pat ourselves on the head. But from an ancient and medieval perspective, contrasting and comparing, what could we say is the same as those perspectives and what could we say is different from those perspectives? The only way to pull that off is to really get to know these other perspectives. We've been working for over a year on this first set, which is the ancient perspective, mostly centered on the Greeks, but also expanding from time to time to other ancient cultures. And chapter 4 is broken up into a number of lettered sections. We've made our way through through the first 5 and into the 6th. One of the things that Stephen asked for last week, which I've been considering doing anyway, so I was highly inclined to agree with him, is to do a retrospective on these 6 sections so far, so that as we resume and continue work on section F, Mythos and Logos, we do so armed with that extra context. What are these? What is the form of the argument that Kenneth Smith has made to date about the differences between the ancient perspective and the modern perspective? So that's what we're going to do today, if nobody has any objections. So we start with nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. This is section A of chapter 4, and the key takeaways here begin with the idea that there's power in language, that there are built into the way that we define terms are assumptions about the world that shape our worldview, that frame it in so that certain things are thinkable or noticeable, and other things are either unthinkable or not noticeable. The framework that we use to begin defining the world right off the bat suggests what are things we can question and what are things we cannot question. And so core to this examination of different cultures are a few Kenneth Smith terms. He doesn't use them here, but he's thinking them when he's writing this. And one of them is absurd, which is an inexpressible idea. Absurd is a term that from within the context of a given framework can't be expressed at all. It seems to fall between categories. It seems to fall into the background of things we never think about. Another critical term is a lacuna, which is a gap in understanding. And a lacunae, the terminology comes from, over 1,000 years, 2,000 years of study of ancient manuscripts, which are often damaged, and there are missing passages or passages that are obscured. Maybe a cat with wet feet walked across the ink, but there are parts you can't quite make out, and these are lacunae. And so when we think of it as a text, it's easy to understand. But as moderns, we're predisposed to not want to apply this term to our own view of the world. We don't like the idea that there are gaps in our ability to perceive the world. We want to believe we're objective and scientific and rational and educated, and therefore we want to believe we see the world as it actually is, and not from any warped perspective. But Kenneth Smith argues it's no challenge at all to find topics, that even very important topics about the world and our place in it, that moderns almost never talk about. And when they do, it's very difficult and tangential. Somehow doesn't fit within sweet spot for us of things that we tend to notice and understand. Another critical term is benightedness. And this is the opposite of enlightenment. Benightedness is the idea of unilluminated parts of ourselves, the things that we are not aware of, a condition in which the main obstacle standing between us and enlightenment is our own inability to perceive what's actually going on. If we knew, we wouldn't make the arguments we make. We wouldn't be persuaded by the things we're persuaded by. These are all critical terms. So with these in mind, well, let's go right to the title. Phusis is the Greek term for nature, and it means becoming or changing. And this is where we get our term physics from. So when he says nature as becoming, there's a tautology built there. He's giving you all the hint you need that he's referring specifically to the ancient Greek term for nature. Of course, the reason he's doing that is we're supposed to be exercising ourselves to step out of the modern perspective on nature and into the ancient perspective on nature. It helps if we actually use the ancient terms, because the ancient terms have built into them certain assumptions about how the world works. And phusis, which means becoming, has built into it this idea that all things flow. So the moment you start talking about all things flowing and changing, you've got Heraclitus all over the place. Kenneth Smith sees Heraclitus not as an atypical Greek philosopher. He's rare, but that the philosophy he's describing is perhaps a more potent, unusually potent formulation of what most ancient Greeks believed. This is one of Kenneth Smith's arguments, that Plato doesn't represent the norm, Aristotle doesn't represent the norm. They're both writing very late in Athens, in Athens's era of domination. By the time Aristotle's writing, the Peloponnesian War's already happened. Everything's falling apart. And Plato himself is writing in a retrospective sense, in which he's encapsulating and critiquing and pitting against each other the different philosophies of different philosophers who've been writing for quite some time before he was even born. So Kenneth Smith sees Heraclitus's philosophy of nature and epistemology as closer to the norm for what the Greeks thought. I'm going to call on Stephen in just a second. I'm just going to wrap up this part of the passage by saying it was said by certain ancient reporters that the scroll of philosophy that Heraclitus wrote was entitled On Nature, or alternately that it had multiple parts, one of which was called On Nature. There's disagreement among the commentators. But either way, of course, he didn't write in English. It wouldn't have been called On Nature. It would have been called Periphuseos. And Phuseus is the shall we say, inflected form of the word phusis. So this is right into the title of section 8. We're talking about phusis, we're talking about Heraclitus, and we're talking about the nature of change and how can things exist in a cosmos that's eternally changing. Stephen, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Also, an Austin group which is following the Republic and the trial of Socrates. So they're up to the trial of Socrates now. And I started to notice something in Socrates which is well understood. They don't mention it in the series of lectures we're listening to, but they call it the Socratic turn. That Socrates was originally trying to be a Heraclitus. Whatever, he was criticized a bit, wasn't working out. And he came up with a new idea. Rather than explore nature or objective reality, I'll turn the big telescope around, a microscope or whatever, around on the subjective nature. So here we have the Socratic turn. I've noticed also there was a Nietzschean turn. Well, actually, Rudolf Steiner pointed out the Nietzschean turn, and that was when Nietzsche went from what was a conventional idealism into dynamism, into the concept of power. And of course, people don't notice that, but we are hanging at the moment between ideas around reason. And there's a lot of people that are thinking power is the way to go. I don't need reason. If I can beat somebody else over the head and make them agree with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the turning the philosophical lens back upon the human being follows strongly from the instruction of the oracle at Delphi, know thyself, gnosis auton, which Socrates made a cornerstone of his own teachings, and his visits to the oracle transformed him philosophically. He came back home and proclaimed his quest to spread the word that mortals know nothing. Mortals don't understand the world, and since Socrates is a man, since he's mortal, he doesn't know anything, and that's the beginning of wisdom. And in doing so, yeah, he's following in the footsteps of Heraclitus, who has fragments that directly refer to know thyself, the use of the verb gnothi, and he has a response to the oracle at Delphi, which is, I have searched myself. It's the sum total of the fragment. And it's Kenneth Smith believes that is, although not frequently cited, it's one of Heraclitus's most important fragments, because he's establishing his bona fides as a philosopher by basically saying the same thing that Socrates would later say, which is, you can't engage in philosophy unless you first struggle with the main problem, which is ourselves. That we who are doing the looking and the understanding are introducing the distortions between us and reality, and we need to study ourselves to study the nature of those distortions if we're ever going to have a chance of correcting our view, so that we can see what's really going on. And of course, you can see that thread running all throughout this long tradition of existentialist philosophy, right into this very book, which is the whole project of this book, to learn to correct the distortions. We're still, and Kenneth Smith makes this point a lot, in very few words, Heraclitus densely sums up most of the major challenges of philosophy 2,500 years ago. And in many cases says the pithiest, crunchiest, meatiest, most evocative, wide-ranging, declarations about those topics. So nature is becoming and as intrinsic truth. Well, so why, if we get why nature is becoming because of the use of the word phusis, that raises all kinds of questions. Right there in the definition of the word, it raises questions. Why are things moving? A universe in which things are constantly moving about and transforming requires more explanation to the intuitive mind of a human being than a universe in which everything is mostly by definition still, in which things are what they are, and you can just look at a thing and it is what it seems to be. If everything is constantly transforming and in motion, it implies that we have not a static, passive, easy to understand cosmos, but a difficult to understand cosmos in which things are often not what they seem, because they're the fruit of some earlier seed, or they're the seed of some future fruit. There are these lines of relationship and causality and transformation that demand explanation. So right off the bat, this notion of nature as becoming has built into it the concept of nature as a problem for human beings to try to understand. Nothing is as simple as we want it to be. We're going to have to work to understand. And that if there's movement, we know from the terminology of basic mechanical physics from Newton that means there's dynamism, there's force at work. We're talking about a cosmos of forces that are setting things into motion and into transformation. So, the question of how do you find out what those forces are and what are you supposed to do about them is built right into the word phusis. You can't even refer to nature as an ancient Greek without raising a fountain of questions. It is a lot of, we have a predisposition as modern toward facts. We like pieces of information that just sit there passively. They are what they are, they're not what they're not, and they wait for us to act upon them. The idea of a word that instead of passively waiting for us to act is instead a fountain of motion and order that sort of places demands upon us is a uncomfortable position for a modern to be in. We don't want words, let alone reality, to be like that. The second half of this title, Nature as Intrinsic Truth, comes at the same topic from another angle. The angle is that to a modern, and I'll call on Phil in a moment. Actually, I'm going to call on Phil now, and I'll come back to this later because this is the beginning of a whole new thing. So go ahead, Phil. Come on, tell us what's on your mind.
There seems to be kind of a problem then, in a sense. If Plato comes along and no longer trusts the world of appearances, which is constantly changing, okay, as you mentioned, then he, in a sense, started the philosophy of mind. And the problem with the mind is that it tends to want to hold things still and objectify things, hold still. So in some sense, a photograph is more real than a moving picture. But that's kind of a contradiction. And let's not go to the extreme of holding still. The mind seemed to need to slow things down so we could think through, still in motion, the process slowly. So therefore, there seems to be a kind of funny contradiction. Maybe I shouldn't call it a contradiction, but something that has to go beyond that. In other words, the person who actually is in the world dealing with the war or hunting a beast or whatever, being in a hurricane, it's actually seeing the world more real than the philosopher in the Ivy Tower contemplating. Now, how would a hurricane happen? You see what I'm saying? And so there seems to be a kind of funny contradiction because on the one hand, you perceive the world as a phenomenon is not really what the world is, but it's a phenomena, a secondary effect. So you have to reconstitute the phenomena into something that in a sense resembles what the reality is, as best you could. You can't do that fast. It just can't happen. Let's say you work with an equation. I mean, it takes a long time to work out the equation. Or even if you're just writing a novel, of a myth, it takes a long time to think through all the things. So what it means is that the mind, the thinking mind, let me do that, is incapable of really grasping the world as it is, because by the time you grasp it, it's over. Okay. I just this morning saw a thing that really frightens me. It's about AI. And this guy was arguing that AI is going to be introduced to war machines. And the problem with war machines, and particularly with hypersonic missiles and things going really, really fast, okay? By the time they launch a hypersonic missile, you don't have the time to say, should we respond or not? And he's saying that what's going to happen as war evolves is that AI will have to make a preset, algorithm that decides once it crosses this line, you react no matter what it is, because you don't even know what the consequence is, but you have to react, because if you don't, it's too late. So as it speeds up, there's going to be a problem in which we lose control and at best hand it over to an automatic machine that could make decision right or wrong faster than we can. And so in some sense, contemplation is out of the question. I mean, contemplation is good when you have a long time to think about it, and I always like to tell people to slow down, think about things. but it almost seems like, you know, imagine if you're fighting in a war, you know, with the arrows and spears or whatever, or gun, and something's happened. Oh, let me think about that. You ain't gonna have much time to think about it before you're dead. So you're gonna have to like shoot and ask questions later. That doesn't seem right in a moral universe, right?
Yes.
Somebody asked me that question. If a thief or somebody broke into your house, would you hesitate? And I said, I probably give him a benefit of the doubt. And he says, too late. Right. And so how do you deal with that situation? Do I have an automatic computer that is geared with machine guns, you know, like as soon as the guy crossed the thing, the gun shoots off, and you take it to court and say, I had nothing to do with it. The machine gun went off by itself. And so how do you deal? It's like, it's almost as if mind given to us, like it's like God gave us a mind that is inadequate to deal with situation as it really is. So it's just a funny paradox I would bring up. So that's it, Phil.
Yeah, it's been said that, you know, freedom and or intelligence lie in the distance between stimulus and response. And the more we just act immediately in response to things, the less there's any intelligence or freedom involved. You know, when you use a pool cue to knock the cue ball into another ball, none of them are exercising any free will. So the second they're touched, the force transfers, and what happens next is predetermined. So it's ironic that we find ourselves as moderns extolling the great values of freedom, and yet somehow we've arranged our world and society into such a structure that we feel like we have to eliminate the distance between stimulus and response in order to respond quickly enough, which means we are making ourselves unfree. And this is one of Kenneth Smith's arguments in this book, as we'll see as we get along, is the more you scratch the veneer of our various slogans about ourselves, the more you discover that in many cases who we actually are is the opposite of who we claim to be as a world epoch. And freedom is one of the classic examples of that. We talk relentlessly about freedom, but when you look at the structure of the world that we've made, most of us have far less freedom than anybody has ever had in the history of the world. There are exceptions. There are prisoners. There are slaves who live lives of misery, and so forth. But the average person in most epochs had a lot more choices available to them than we do. All right, back to this. So nature is becoming and is intrinsic truth. So a dynamic cosmos, a cosmos of change and transformation, a cosmos in which things aren't obvious, but the subtle things are important and need to be studied and need to be examined. Roberto Colosso wrote a book of Greek mythology called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. It's one of Kenneth Smith's favorites. It's well worth looking into. And in it, chapter after chapter, Colosso shows how in the Greek myths, the Greeks are obsessed with transformation, with things becoming people changing shape, things becoming other than they are, people becoming gods, gods becoming human. I mean, just over and over, there are things transforming from one to another. And he runs his myths from the very earliest myths. I think he starts with Europa, and goes to later myths, generation by generation, showing how these themes of transformation and phusis run throughout the whole thing. And it's easy for a modern to overlook, because every time we read a typical book about the Greek myths, we just see them as a bunch of separate stories that all sort of exists in an eternal, published, written state. All these things are happening side by side at once as we read. But the idea that they were trying to map something with this is something we're going to come back to when we get to section F down below. But it's set up right here. So nature as becoming, the argument about is nature static or dynamic goes right to the philosophical discipline of ontology, which is one of the major branches of philosophy. And what's curious is that although for us, anyone who becomes a philosopher in the modern world can certainly pick up one side or the other of the dynamic versus static argument, or try some novel third position. In general, we assume that all these topics are up for gab. Let's just feel like let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. Anything could be true. Who knows? Let's just see what the line of argument looks like. Whereas to the Greeks, the problem is resolved in the word itself, nature, physis. It's becoming. It is a dynamic, transformative universe, which means that when philosophers like Parmenides, argued that it wasn't, that things were static, what they were not doing is what a modern would be doing when they take up such a position, which is, well, here's an idea. Let's, just as good as your idea, let's just have a discussion and explore the possibilities. To the Greeks, what Parmenides was doing was fantastically contrarian, because every Greek knew it was a universe of change. There's a line in Plato where he ascribes fluxus quo and the philosophy of change, not just to Heraclitus, but to Homer. And I've read a number of commentaries on that line saying, well, this is weird. Was Homer a philosopher? Did Homer ever say anything about a universe of change? How can Plato say that he has this position? And of course, what we're overlooking is we're reading a translation in which Homer says the word nature over and over, and we think that still leaves the question up for discussion about whether it's a static universe or a dynamic one. But Homer wasn't using the word nature, which is derived from the Romans, which would come later. He was using the word physis, which says right in the word itself that it is a universe of change. And Homer takes this position without explaining it, because he knows every other Greek takes this position without needing it explained to them. It's built right into their vocabulary. And the reason I'm stressing this time in a way that I didn't the first time is to emphasize the process of taking for granted, right? Because it shows how much power there is in the ways in which the unquestioned, default, unconscious, unnoticed, automatic things predispose any discussion we could possibly have, right? So to the Greeks, this was a resolved question before philosophy was even invented. It was built right into their language that way. So that's ontology, but the second half of this title is epistemology, nature as intrinsic truth, And to a modern, that's baffling. Truth is established, in dictionaries or encyclopedias. It's established in parliaments, when they pass laws and say, this is the truth of how our society will be run. It's established by teachers and authority figures. If you don't go for all that stuff, you can say, well, no, truth will be established through our human processes of reasoning by which we will arrive at the truth. So, for example, logic and mathematics can establish truth, we believe. And science, the process, following properly the processes of science will establish what the truth is. And in all these cases, we believe that it takes a human action to apply truth to the world. That the world, we without knowing it, we've inherited this medieval idea. The world has no meaning of its own. And the medievals thought that for a different reason. We think it because we think we're the masters of the universe. Nature's not binding upon us. It's our job just to figure out, it's the Newtonian idea that it's some kind of great machine, and our job is to pick it apart, figure out how it works, and then get control of it so that we can make better lives for ourselves, so we can get what we want, right? Which is the real driving force for us as moderns. And in order to get what we want, we can pick apart nature however we want to, and then do anything to nature that we know how to do. Whether it's plant a crop or drop a nuclear bomb, if we know how to do it, we have the right to do it. The only thing standing, go ahead, Steve.
We're actually saying that we're smarter than nature.
Yes.
When we do that.
Moderns believe they're smarter than nature. Yes. Right. It's just a default position. I mean, plenty of moderns would argue that they don't think that. And if you get them into a discussion, they'll tell you how they don't think that. But if you watch their behavior, it's obvious they do think that. We go along with what the modern world does, and what the modern world does is chop down forests, dig up plains and plant our own plants there. We change everything. We believe there's nothing that shouldn't be changed if we feel like it. And so the only force we feel like we have to negotiate with is other people. We'll pass laws, we'll have discussions and debates, try to make sure that other people don't get in our way. But otherwise, with that constraint, we don't seriously believe anything's going to in nature is going to stop us, as long as we figure out how nature works and push the right buttons and pull the right levers. So there is a way in which moderns are unaware of the extent to how our interpretation of nature builds into it an epistemology, not just an ontology. It's not just a philosophy of being and existence, change versus not change, for example. It's a philosophy of knowledge. And the knowledge is there are facts in the world to be collected, but they don't become knowledge or meaning until human beings choose to apply an interpretation to them. And that's when they become truth of some form. It was very common in the 20th century in university classes at the physics level that if you were learning about some new principle of physics and you raised your hand and you asked why, you'd get roundly chewed out and humiliated in front of the class by the professor, who would tell you why is the wrong question to ask. You're not allowed to ask why. There is no why to nature. No whys, no meaning. It's just a machine. It does what it does. Why is supposed to be the province of human beings. We can have reasons and whys. We can apply meaning and truth. We create meaning and truth is the modern interpretation. It wasn't there to begin with. And this particular, I'm hammering this because this interpretation of nature describes a nature that's a vacuum, that contains facts, sure, but no truth, no meaning. It's completely void of all of those things. And it's waiting for human beings to impose truth and meaning upon it. This is in contrast to medieval perspective, which was that, yes, the universe has no meaning, but that's because it's God who gives it all meaning. Or God, the ultimate source of knowledge and meaning and so forth, he applies meaning and truth to his creation. It has meaning at most as a reflection of his glorious purpose. But otherwise, it has no truth of its own. Both of these positions are in radical opposition to the ancient perspective. And the ancient perspective is built right there in the word physis. Everything's changing all the time, which means there's dynamic forces going on, which means there are things here we need to understand. Whether without some God applying transcendentally meaning or truth from without, without some committee or legislature applying truth or meaning from without, nature already means things. It's already full of more than just facts. It's full of truths. It's a fountain of meaning and truth. It's just overflowing. It's a plenum full to the top with meaning and truth. And that's why he uses the word in this title, intrinsic truth. Not extrinsic, not transcendental, not applied from without by God or humanity, but immanent, intrinsically immanent within the very fabric of nature is meaning and truth, according to the ancient Greeks. And in this, they were in direct opposition to both medievals and moderns who agree about this one thing, that nature is meaningless. So that's where we are so far. Phil, you got your hand up. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I think there certainly is a lot of truth to that. My thought is, let's just eliminate human beings for the moment and just think about nature, like lions and tigers and polar bears and whatever, all that, trees. It is hard for me to believe that the lion actually understands the ecology of all the other things around. It responds to it. I'm sure that it's true. It responds to it because it sort of understands in a narrow sense that its relationship to the things around it in a way. Okay, so I wouldn't say that it already has the knowledge and therefore like, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to do that, I'm going to go this way, that way. And so there's almost, in this way, at least the way we think about, it is sort of operating with a mindless mind. I mean, there is a mind, but the mindless mind, because lions seem to somehow understand that, like when to stop killing I mean, it's not like, oh, this is fun, let's just kill some more, right? It somehow seems to, I don't know if it intuits it or just like, oh, you know, that's enough, like that's good, let's stop. And so there's an intuitive relationship between it and its relationship to the things around it. And when it needs it, it goes after it. But after it got what it got, it's like, okay, that's good enough. And so the mind of the ecology, in a sense, penetrates subliminally in a way to the mind of the lion. So it's almost as if you want to look at it that way, is as if the mind of the ecological environment is pulling the puppet strings to the lion. And somehow mankind came along and said, no, we don't like being pulled by the puppet strings. You know, like, we're going to go on off our own. And, you know, like, instead of killing one deer, that's good enough. We're going to kill, why not half of them? Or the buffaloes, all those buffaloes that they piled their skulls, their head just to, it's like, we just don't know when to stop. And I brought this up because tonight, this evening, there's going to be a wonderful discussion on the movie by Yasujiro Ozu called Late Spring. It's a wonderful movie. And it's the movie about relationships. It's very intricate, very subtle. But the central issue is like the relationship between the aging father, who I guess at that time was 56, and the daughter who's 27, considered in Japanese society already on the old side. So he finally realizes that as much as he depended on her and loved her very much, that he's got to move and get her to get married, which was tough because she loved her father. And the main reason she loved her father, and particularly at this age, is she cares for her father. And she's afraid that what will he do when she's gone? Because she's his support, so to speak. And the father had to trick her by pretending that he's going to get married again. And in a way, he doesn't say it directly. In a way, she would be kind of like the odd man out, so to speak. Okay, so that's one way of moving the distance. That very much upset her. And one evening, sort of toward the end, she was saying, like, Father, you know, I really don't want to leave this relationship because I'm so happy with this relationship. This is what I want. He says, I'm 56. It's simply a matter of time before I'm gone and you'll be alone, right? And she said, you need to look for something. Well, I guess she wanted to find somebody that will eventually happen or not happen, that she's in love with. And he says, you know, love is something that you develop and build. He said, when I first met your mother, she was quite alien to me. And then slowly we did things together, we built things together, and we built a relationship that in essence created the love bondage that exists. And says you will need to do that and not be distracted by your future husband, like, oh, I don't like this guy the way he looks or whatever, okay? And just know that your existence is an effort to build those relationships with the world, and in this case, your significant other, and that's the relationship you build with me. Now you have to build with somebody else because I'll be gone. And of course, and he says, you know, I'll be okay. And that was very interesting. The last scene was she had left. She got married. She was talking to the woman that he pretended he was going to marry. And he says, oh, that was the biggest lie I had to tell her, in a sense, get her to that thing. And then when the conversation ended, the woman left. You see, he was hanging up his own clothes. He was doing his own thing. And then you could see that he was very lonely and depressed. And that was a sacrifice he made for the other that he cared about, which is just a beautiful, very subtle movie. And there are many other symbols along the way. I want to tell you that. It just seems to me, that seems to be a relationship that is not, it's sort of conceptual, but it's not conceptual, but it's built in terms of care and relationship to the world around you. So I would say that. So thank you, Phil.
Can you put the title of that film in the chat?
Yeah, I could do that.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I'd like to follow up and watch that. Joseph, you got your hand up.
You can watch it through Art Appreciation, or I think also the Toronto group.
Okay.
One of the things that I was actually just thinking about is maybe one of the connections that we can make is between the idea of cosmopolitanism versus the modern. Because the reason I say that is that you had brought up the idea of the inherent worth of nature. And you would start seeing the inherent worth of individuals. And when you stop seeing that, and let's just say you make technology or other things your God, well, then you start deviating away from saying that intrinsic worth that individuals have is not necessarily, it's not important anymore, because you have a value that's higher. It's a higher order value. So, I hate to come back to this extreme example because it's used all too often, but this idea that our nation's the best in Germany, Nazi Germany. Here we have, and we've talked about it extensively, the most technologically advanced culture at that period of time, with a great deal of philosophers and writers and thinkers, and somehow they fell into this trap that they stopped seeing everybody else's, the inherent worth in everyone else, and that deviates from nature. And I think that that's something that is, you've lost something that the Greeks saw as themselves as a citizen of the world. And that is, and you start to lose the value of human life or nature itself. And I think that's really kind of captures part of the danger of when we tend to think we've created an answer to all our problems. And I do think that this is something that is actually still today plagues us to a certain degree. When people think that technology is going to solve all the problems for humanity. And that's not necessarily the case. And I hear this all the time, that people think that, that somehow everybody's going to have enough to eat. We're going to have, and things will be better off. I'm not saying that it's not part of the solution, but and I hope that it does provide a certain amount of standard of living for people. However, it's not going to solve all of humanity's problems. Humanity has to solve its own problems, and that gets back to the idea of the intrinsic and being in touch with nature. And I would argue the idea of the virtues themselves in that are essential to well, to arete, as one of Kenneth's sections has put it. So I just think of this, that's one aspect of, that we've kind of been covering. It's a very small aspect of cosmopolitanism is, it's something that has been lost, and seemingly it's actually, I don't know, it seems to be dissipating to a certain degree, because I think there's like a nationalistic bend that's going on in the world. Anyway, those are just some initial thoughts.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, we between what you said and what Phil said, there are these aspects of nature that were very visible to the ancient Greeks, but that we have trouble focusing on. Like Phil talked about the mindless mind, the way that you can see in nature an intelligence at work, and yet you see it even in things that don't have brains. So how is that possible? And we think to ourselves, how can a tree have so much intelligence to the way that it unfolds unless it has a brain to tell it how to unfold? We're used to thinking about intelligence as an act of will that forces form upon passive matter. And so we really are confused by a tree that has no brain. Where is its will supposed to reside? Where is its designer? That we have this, as moderns, we don't even realize the extent to which we still have the medieval designer in our head, and the idea that things can't come into existence unless first some superior intelligence designs it. So we want to see, if not the plans, we at least want to see the brain, where the design could, we can have a leap of faith and say, well, the brain must contain the design. And so therefore it makes sense that it could do that. But, the fungus isn't going to please us, because it's not going to show us a brain anywhere, as it builds its complex networks that allow it to plug in across an entire forest in a way that's incredibly, that we couldn't design if we sat down with a piece of paper to design it. We couldn't come up with something as complex and adaptive as what the fungus does without any brains at all. And we see this as, well, this was something that Darwin talks about in his books on evolution that we still have trouble with. We still don't really like, which is the idea that billions of years of evolution could produce so much adaptive, and from our perspective, really intelligent design without ever having intended to do any of it, without intention or will being involved at all. It's very hard for a modern to separate intelligence and will. When we figure, what's intelligence for if it's not to impose your will on things? And so how can things be manifesting so much intelligence without, in the absence of a will? This whole set of problems is created because of our assumptions as moderns. And we read it into every situation we look at. We certainly read it into all the literature of the past that we read. We assume people think the same way we do on these topics because we don't even know we're thinking this way. It just seems so natural to assume that they go together. So the concept that the ancient Greeks could see intelligence and meaning and truth as being intrinsic and implicit and unconscious, but nevertheless present and powerful at the same time. This plays to one of our blind spots, where we read every passage where they just come out and straight out say, as clearly as they can, that that's what's happening. And we read every one of those passages as not saying at all that that's what's happening, because that's absurd to us. It's inexpressible, that these are things that can't go together. So that must not be what he meant. So we read it as something else. And our capacity to do that, to look directly at somebody, say, as fluent in language and rhetoric as Plato, who can lay out the argument very cleanly for us and say exactly what he means, and we can read exactly those words in translation, or even if we learn ancient Greek, we can read it directly in his words, and yet still not hear what he's saying, because that's not a set of ideas that we not only can't we disagree with it, we can't even hear it. We don't even see it there. He must be saying something else, so we see that. So this is all, again, built into this idea of phusis having these these two sides to the coin, that it addresses ontology by arguing for a cosmos full of transformation and dynamic powers, and that it argues for a cosmos full of meaning, in which the reason that things can go through these astonishing metamorphoses and come out a butterfly instead of just a puddle of goo is because there is truth and meaning and intelligence at work, even where there's no brain at work. That there is this kind of experiential, incremental, adaptive intelligence that can take place without anybody having to force it to take place or will it to take place. These are easy ideas to the ancient Greeks, and they're almost inexpressible for us. Stephen, go ahead. What's on your mind?
I'm just going to counter Joseph and say the Greeks didn't start out with a cosmopolitan frame of mind. If the stories are true, for example, we have the mystery of the sea people, we have the mystery of the collapse of peoples like the Hittites, and that's something crazy was going on about 1200 BC, or they don't know. But the Greeks started out with the mindset of, tour the world, meet interesting people, rip them off and kill them. The cosmopolitan attitude was a million miles in the future. If it was ever going to exist, you'd have to demonstrate the philosophers which talked about a cosmopolitan frame of mind that appeared later, after all the adventures of seeing and touring the world the way the Greeks like to do it. But really, if you look at the Greeks and their attitude was so arrogant, and they were coming up against Middle Eastern peoples which had a slightly different frame of mind, that these Middle Eastern peoples would have thought, oh no, the Greeks are in town again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's part of what's interesting about the word Greeks, is that the Greeks defined themselves by these epochs that connected them to the Bronze Age peoples that preceded them. But the Greeks of classical Greece were an Iron Age people, not a Bronze Age people. And the more we compare and contrast their culture to the culture of the Mycenaeans, for example, the more, especially if you buy into Kenneth Smith's historical framework, the more you might start to suspect that the Mycenaeans were not part of the ancient epoch, they were part of the previous epoch, because the Greeks are so different from them. And in particular, that the Mycenaeans longed, in Homer's words, above all, they longed to individually distinguish themselves as sackers of cities. Each man on the plains of Troy wanted to be the man who sacked Troy, who brought it down. And they were fighting each other, scrambling at each other, as we see in the Iliad, tearing at each other in order to be the one who gets to be called the sacker of cities. And you can draw a direct line from a culture that's obsessed with that to the Bronze Age collapse. It's not hard to see how you could get touring war bands going from city to city, tearing them all down until everything fell apart. But there's something that happens after you've torn everything apart and you're sitting around with your home and everybody else's home's in flames and it's winter and you got nothing to eat, which is, some of you are going to clue in that maybe being a sacker of cities wasn't such a bright idea. And maybe what's called for is a new kind of civilization. I always think about the classical age of Greece as a tug of war between the people who wanted to learn from the Greek Dark Age and make a new, more sustainable kind of Greece, versus the ones who longed to just recreate the Golden Age that preceded the Dark Age and do it all over again. And that the collapse into the Peloponnesian War and the other wars that followed was in some sense the result of the former not being able to fully persuade the latter. And in the end, they ended up recreating too much of the original collapse. But they were trying not to. At least some of them were trying not to. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, I got it. As you were talking about that, it reminded me of something about the nature of harmony. The Greeks were kind of into that. And it seems to me that in some sense is the intelligence you're talking about that, let's say, Fusus was trying to tap into. And I was looking for this quote, so here it is. This is written by Beethoven, who's definitely not a Greek, but because he's a musician, he certainly understands harmony. And he said, music is the one incorporeal entrance into a higher world of knowledge, which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend. I consider Beethoven perhaps the most important man in the 19th century, of a lot of great men. But the fact that he, he's almost a demigod. He's so worshipped in a funny way, certainly in the 19th century, that in a way, you think of him as maybe a bit arrogant because, he is so powerful in what he does. But ultimately, he seemed to be quite humble because the cosmos seemed to understand us to which we could not understand. And I wonder whether even the which we cannot understand certainly applies to the higher knowledge, higher understanding. So we are feeling it, we're harmonizing it as best we could with it, but we don't understand it, but somehow it understands us, which is interesting, okay? And that beyond that, I don't even know if which is also applies to the fact that we don't quite understand the entrance to the pathway itself. So we actually don't quite understand music, which is interesting. And then finally, the which is confusing which one it applies to. We don't even understand ourselves. That's a whole lot of misunderstanding. But still, in spite of that, there's a lot of great music. So that is very, very interesting. Like, talk about a blind, bumbling fool, but a genius. I mean, how the hell did that happen, right? He's actually confessing he doesn't understand the higher understanding. He doesn't understand music. He doesn't even understand himself. And there he is. And we worship him as a demigod. Maybe that's why he's only a demigod rather than a god. So I find that just a very deep, confession of sorts of Beethoven. So I'll just leave it there, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, Beethoven. I love me a lot of Beethoven. I listen to him a lot. I study his life a lot. The whole struggle, kind of composition as a struggle to apply one's gifts in a world that may or may not fully appreciate them. It's interesting stuff. The ways he tied himself into various knots, and I particularly like the story that he was obsessed with the great man theory, and composed Eroica and dedicated it to Napoleon until Napoleon turned out to be a dick. And then he crossed out the dedication. I can't remember if he dedicated to, I think he dedicated it to somebody else after that, but it was like, you know what? I've been so wrong at a fundamental level.
Sounds a bit like Heidegger.
Yeah. So, yes. So continuing section A, nature is becoming and as intrinsic truth. The next idea in section A that Kenneth gets into as being core to the ancient world is the idea of, we have, even though we've evacuated the word nature of most of the meaning that it originally had, Just like the word physis comes from the Greeks, the word nature comes from Latin natura, which means having been born. It is, when we talk about nature, we're talking about the realm of mortal things. We're talking about the realm of things that have a beginning and an end. They're born, they flourish, and eventually, but then eventually they die. And that these cycles of life are part of the aliosis, another Greek term, othering, right? And natura, having been born. So aliosis was the Greek way of talking about physis as a process rather than in all the other senses. And it is the sense in which things become other than they are. Mutatis mutandis. It's a realm of metamorphosis. And so, with natura having been born, that the Romans, being practical minded folk, are settling on a particular aspect of physis. Which is that we transform from not existing at all to being born and helpless to growing into our powers, and then to the powers fading and us dying. This metamorphosis is the one that the Romans are emphasizing in the Latin term natura. And so as we speak, whatever we talk about nature, where there are these ghosts of meaning, unintended and often unnoticed by us in what we're saying. And we're inclined to say, well, if we didn't mean to mean it, then we don't mean it, because we privilege conscious will as imposing meaning upon things. But anybody who's had the experience of going to counseling and having the sudden abrupt left turn when the counselor says, and does that remind you of your mother? You're like, what? No, of course it doesn't remind me of my mother. Stop asking me about my mother. I don't want to talk about hidden currents that might be drawing me along. But it's not an accident that, people who are studying the human mind inevitably end up looking at and discovering deep unconscious hidden currents that tug us along, whether we like it or not. And it's this idea of an implicit hidden world of meaning is very Greek. Right, I shared above the Heraclitus quote, "The hidden harmony is better than the obvious." The idea that the forces and powers that are causing the cosmos to unfold and transform as it does are mostly not obvious. They're not on the surfaces of things. They're underneath somehow. They're somehow intangible and yet all powerful. The tree takes the tree's shape because of some set of forces that we don't directly perceive. We can see the signature of the forces in what the tree becomes, but we can't see the forces themselves. And yet it's obvious they're powerful because there's trees all over the world. It would be powerful enough if there had been only a single tree that came into existence without us having designed it. But instead they're everywhere and they're cropping up all the time. So, there is this sense in which the invisible, or certain parts of the invisible, dominate the visible in ways that are very uncomfortable for literal-minded people. And so some of that is carried along in the sense of where do meaning and truth come from. We in English borrow this Latin term natura because of our long period of having been, under the domination of medieval monks who used Latin as their lingua franca, and therefore infused our Germanic language full of Latinate phrases. And yet we don't fully ask ourselves, what does it mean when we deploy these words? We assume that it means what we want it to mean. By nature, we mean, that pantry and toolbox that we get resources out of and bend to our will. We don't mean we are mortals and our understanding is limited just like our lives are. We're not trying to say those things when we use the word nature. But of course, it's not our word. We have just co-opted it, and it's going to carry along a bounty of meaning, whether we like it or not, anytime that we deploy it. And the Romans were very well acquainted with the Greek as well. So if you were a Roman and you deployed the word natura, it not only meant to you these issues about the cycles of birth and death and the transformations associated with that, but they also knew that the Greek word was physis. This was, was fairly wide understanding that the Greeks had this other term, and that it meant the broader perspective on transformation and flow and becoming and change. And that you just can't even start talking about the world without stepping into these rivers full of currents that are flowing places. It's part of why of the various Heraclitus fragments we've lost, among the ones that survive is his metaphor of the river you can't step into twice, because the Romans did a great job of preserving it. They cited that fragment all the time. They knew exactly what he was talking about. As different as they were from the ancient Greeks, they still were part of the same worldview and the same epoch. And nature had for them a sacred potency as a source of existence and truth that it doesn't have for moderns. And that helps us to understand the ancient worldview. So I'll come back to this some more in a moment, but first, Stephen, what's on your mind?
This has been a problem when I've been talking to people, which seem to be reasonably intelligent people. But I go and pay homage to the god of etymology. When I see a word, I want to find out the etymology of it. And a whole bunch of people I know will look around at me and say, why are you bothering with that? We make words mean what we want them to mean, which must be partly true. There are words which modern people have made to mean what they want them to mean, and they've diverged greatly from where they originated. But I'm a bit worried about this whole concept, because if we do that, that means each individual person will eventually have their own peculiar language. That can be a problem, don't you think? So I find this whole attitude that we will make words mean what we want them to mean is very Baron von Munchausen. That is, we can pick ourselves up out of the water by our own pigtails. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I always think of Alice in Wonderland, and Alice's argument with the Queen saying, well, I mean, isn't what's important what words really mean? I mean, isn't that really what's at issue? And the Queen's, no, the issue, what's at issue is who's to be boss. It's to impose our meaning upon the world. That's what it's all about. And when you start to agree with Lewis Carroll's hypersensitivity to the willfulness of human beings, you start to see it everywhere, especially in the modern world. We are very willful. And we are incredibly willful in ways that we don't particularly want to think about. We want to be able to exert our will in ways that produce the consequences that we had in mind, and no unintended consequences at all. The entire framework of Greek tragedy, which is about unintended consequences, is something that we don't particularly like. We might use it to pass the time or make a buck, but we really don't want to be thinking about how every time we exercise our will, we're also setting in motion things that we didn't intend, some of which we're not going to like very much. And what I like about the Xerox example that I posted in the chat of a modern word that somebody could make up and say, well, it means what we want it to mean, and it doesn't mean anything else, is that Xerox wanted to popularize their brand, but they didn't want to lose control of their brand, and they lost control of their brand. They were so successful at popularizing Xerox as a verb that it became a verb. And the courts ruled that Xerox could no longer own the word Xerox. People could use Xeroxing to refer to non-Xerox copying machines as well as Xerox copying machines. They lost it. Kleenex is another one that people lost control of. I was reading some history of computer languages in the 1960s. That was, and the interview was done in '72, and the interviewer and interviewee were having a grand old time talking about all kinds of different, old classic computers from the 50s and different companies and their efforts to popularize their computers. And the Xerox example came up specifically in there when they were talking about branding. They're like, you want to succeed, but you don't want to succeed as much as Xerox succeeded, because then you fail. And this idea that when you set your will in motion, you can't entirely control what's going to happen. You start the one pebble rolling down the slope, but you can't demand that the slope not allow other pebbles to join it and turn into a big mess that you weren't trying to create. What can we control and what can we not control? Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, about branding and Xerox and Kleenex and all that. Then I want to ask you a question like, how come we haven't like taken away the brand Coca-Cola from it, from Coke? And the reason I say that is that surprisingly, Coca-Cola is the second most used word in the world. You might say, well, how is that possible, right? The reason is because it's transnational. It's beyond Chinese, it's beyond Russian, it's beyond English. The only word that is more used in the world, this information might be, like 20 years old, but I think it still holds, is okay. Everybody knows okay what it means. It's transnational. Oftentimes when I go to a restaurant, I purposely try to make the waitress or the waiter use the two most used words in the world. They would come as like, what would you like? I would like to have a Coca. I would like to have a Pepsi. Okay, I would say Pepsi because I actually like Pepsi. And then she or he would say, we don't have Pepsi. Would Coca-Cola be okay? And there they are, reinforcing the two most used words in the world. I want to get to a different thing, though. That's a more important issue. Apparently, this discussion came up with in the Hegel seminar that I have, that I've been listening to for about 2 years. It was in the 1920s, when quantum mechanics is very much a new thing, so to speak. And there was a Japanese physics Nobel Prize winner that was apparently talking to some quantum physicists. And somebody asked him a very serious question. How in the hell can you, or the Japanese, even understand quantum mechanics? It seemed like a slight, okay? And it was why would you say that? He said, well, because Japanese does not even have the concept of the future perfect tense. So how can you deal with the future as a reality? In other words, the future perfect is like, I will have done. Right? In other words, it's not that you think you do it, you actually did it by, yesterday or tomorrow, okay? So, and he had actually a very smart answer. He says, well, it's because we haven't been indoctrinated by 2,000 years of Aristotle. So we could get directly at the problem. Of course, he misunderstood the Aristotle, not Aristotle. It's the medievals interpreting Aristotle. But so the fact that you could part the waves of Aristotle interfering with the language and get directly to the thing, like why would that be more difficult than understanding the future perfect? I thought that was a very, very clever and smart answer, by the way, that talks about language. And perhaps the language itself leads to a path that might actually interfere with the actual essence of something, which is very interesting. So the fact that they said, well, you couldn't possibly understand quantum physics to a physicist who won the Nobel Prize, that was a slap in the face. And so I guess he slapped them back. So
Yeah.
there you go.
Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, I think about the Quechua languages in which a basic part of speech that you are supposed to attach to what you're saying is, how do you know this? And to what extent do you know it? It's bad grammar in Quechua not to distinguish between propaganda and something you actually experienced. Like if you talk about something that you heard as propaganda and you refer to it using the forms of speech that indicate direct experience, that is real truth, then it's either a grammatical error or you're insane. Like Quechua has this take that people who can't tell the difference between opinion and reality are not sane people. Either they're not educated enough to be able to make the grammatical distinction, in which case they're ignorant, or they're crazy. And from their perspective, English speakers are all somewhere between ignorant and crazy, because we don't even have those grammatical forms. We don't have the ability to grammatically distinguish what kind of truth we're talking about. And so we routinely mix up ideology with experience. We talk all the time about the characteristics of people we've absolutely never met and don't know anything about. And we do so as though we are speaking God's own truth. These people are going to burn in hell for the following reasons, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, haven't been to hell, haven't had a direct interview with God. God didn't actually personally tell you that those people are going. You just are confusing what your preacher told you, or what some televangelist told you for what actually is going to happen after death. They're category mistakes. And that Quechua languages have this as just core grammar, making it hard to mix these things up. Whereas English doesn't have these as core grammar, making it really easy to mix these things up, is not entirely unrelated to the messed up state of political science in the United States, where people are always yelling at each other about how reality is, as though either side actually had any control over the nature of reality. So I bring up this issue of the freight of meaning around the word nature, because nature has multiple meanings in English and Latin and Greek. Physis in the case of Greek, and the nature is not just about what is the realm in which all things exist and become, and about which there are inherent intrinsic truths. Nature is also the nature of a thing. What is your nature? What is the nature of a tree? And in doing so, the Greeks are setting in motion this idea that everything that we've said to date about physis as a whole also applies to the innate nature of each thing within nature. That is, everything in nature has the nature around them that compels them externally, if you will, or under them, but it also has nature within them that guides their process of unfolding order as they transform from one thing into another thing, as a baby becomes an adult, becomes a senior citizen. These arcs of transformation happen on the intersection between the nature around us, which is pushing on us, and the nature within us that is trying to unfold us within those forces. And as a result, I can't remember if it was Joseph a month or two back, maybe it was Phil, who talked about a pair of terms, contingency and agency. Contingency and agency. And it applies very well to the Greek concept of nature, that there is, there is an extent to which there is agency in which, as things try to unfold according to their inner nature, they have what the Greeks would call a telos, which is a direction, an end toward which they are unfolding. That their own nature gives them a collection of drives that cause them to transform in a certain way. When the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, what comes out the other end is never a cat. Ever. In the history of the world, a cat has never come out of a chrysalis after a caterpillar went in. This is not the nature of this organism. What comes out the other side is a moth or a butterfly or the like.
You need to tell Peter Singer that one.
Yeah, right. Right, exactly. That there is the nature within us it has a particular signature, if you will. It's distinct from other natures, and it's going to cause us to unfold on our little arc of transformation as much as possible according to the direction of that inner nature. And I say as much as possible because how much it actually can is going to be limited by the nature around us. And the jockeying and jostling between the two ends up determining where things ultimately end up. So when we talk about this, we're talking about a tug of war between contingency and agency, or to put it another way, a hidden harmony between contingency and agency, and how they relate to each other moment by moment as our lives unfold. Stephen, and then Donald. Go ahead, Stephen. What's on your mind?
Oh, well, first of all, yeah, you made a reference which comes up philosophically, and that was we developed the age of Newtonian physics, and everybody ran off, and they were having a great time with this new, very mechanistic way of viewing the cosmos. But then you had the romantic reaction, people like Goethe, and he wasn't the only one that said this, and he was warning that this new style of Enlightenment thought had a defect. And the defect was this, that you're generalizing. Now, Goethe would say we have to generalize or we're never going to get anywhere. If we didn't generalize, we'd stop at the first tree we came across and would be there the rest of eternity exploring that tree in its every detail. But this was their warning. The Romantics were warning about this. It's this, you Enlightenment people are generalizing. You have to be beware of that one. Okay, that was a point that brought up. But the other one was that prior to the Greek philosophers exploring publicly the issue of nature, it seems the first glimmer that came in Greek society as it arose from the geometric dark age was the question of the state, politics, what's going to be the establishment of the state, seem to have preceded what is nature as a serious question. So I'm just wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
You're going to ask me that in a few more months, because I'm still reading Karl Lovitz's book From Hegel to Nietzsche, Revolution in 19th Century Thought. And it opens by comparing and contrasting and exploring the relationship between Goethe and Hegel and their differing takes on nature and how where they agreed with each other and where they didn't, and how their lifelong friendship and correspondence kind of changed each of them over time. So I'm about to learn an enormous amount more than I know right now, and I don't want to be an idiot by opening my mouth and sharing what I'm absolutely certain is a relatively uninformed opinion that's about to get a whole lot better. Oh, Siri thinks I'm talking to her. So anyway, so I put a link there to the Internet Archive. You can read it online, check it out an hour at a time and work your way through it. But I mean, you're asking exactly the stuff I'm very curious about right now, Stephen, and I'm literally about to learn more about it. So I'm gonna start by admitting defeat and say I'm on my way to learning more.
Okay, so the other question, did the design of the state, did politics precede the naturalism in Greek history?
Well, definitely it's a back and forth where they affect each other over time and changed each other over time. I mean, you can see it, for example, in the transformation over time from the Mycenaean approach to city-states to the later Hellenic approach to city-states, that there's been a massive change, and a lot of it has come from painful experience with the unintended consequences of the earlier generations of the structures of the states. By the time you get Aristotle writing his Politics and his work on the Athenian Constitution, he and his readers are heavily armed with this backlog of painful experience that they know they can refer to, and that the other people will understand them. And this is a very different position to be in than when the Mycenaeans were first setting up their city-states.
It just seems to me that I think there were philosophers that were purely concerned. Well, maybe they weren't philosophers, maybe they were politicians, but there seemed to be thinkers that were purely concerned with how do us Greeks have a state? How is the state going to be constituted?
Yes.
And of course, we see, for example, quite sophisticated state in the form of the Republic suddenly appear around about 510 BC, 509 BC. Well, it happened in Rome just before Athens, actually.
Right.
Athens supposedly said, no more kings. Kings are out forever. Although they ended up with another king after a few hundred years.
These things happen. But yeah, you can see in the, I think it's the Politics, where Aristotle says man is by nature a political animal. And a modern reads that as meaning man is a political animal. And what Aristotle meant was something more ancient in Greek, which is it is the nature of Homo sapiens that we cannot survive unless we resolve our differences with each other enough to be able to survive. That it's required. It's a necessary requirement. And of course that he also in that way that Greek has of being able to put multiple meanings into the same sentence. At the same time, he's also saying any human being who believes that politics is dirty or bad and that they should be able to live as an individual without ever talking to anybody else is living a subhuman form of existence, because they are failing at reaching the basic minimum of human nature. Because elsewhere, Aristotle says that in all of his examinations of the nature of things, he's not going to look at the sick versions, because you can't learn what a cheetah could be if you look at a cheetah that's crippled. You can learn what a cheetah can be if you look at a cheetah at the height of its powers. And that's where it most clearly stands out from other species. And you go, whoa, so that's cheetahness. And that means that when he's saying man is by nature a political animal, he's saying it is the nature of a healthy human being to be a political animal. And that if you find a human being who's apolitical, who's hyper individualistic, who believes that he should be able to be an isolated monad, yeah, lonely ape, that's right, Stephen. Then you're talking about somebody who's not a healthy Homo sapiens. And of course, he's got more to say on it than that. He's not just striking it out against the extremes of individualism. He'll also strike out against the extremes of groupthink. The Greek philosophers tended to be extremely skeptical about the crowd and just merging. They wanted a more dynamic relationship between the one and the many. So, you're asking the great questions, and I'll get better at answering these as I get further along. Donald, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Well, you'd said earlier that moderns and medievals assign really no importance, that disregard nature. I think that's largely because they see nature as offering no moral guidance. Certainly moderns don't believe anything offers moral guidance, and medievals ascribe that only to God. But the Greeks, and you pretty much just made the point here as a segue on what it is that nature is normative, and I won't say moral. It doesn't have little aphorisms, like it's not like you wander around, you find the 10 Commandments carved into rocks or something. But in the idea that nature has a telos, and that individual things have their arche that guide their development. It's normative. Caterpillars don't turn into cats. Exactly. Now, moderns may wonder, well, who's been oppressing these caterpillars all this time? If a caterpillar wanted to self-identify as a cat, I think we'd have to agree with that. But anyway, you've pretty much made the point I wanted to make about how nature is moral for the Greeks, and it's not that it has cute aphorisms or something like that.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point. Now so Heraclitus talks about this notion of the nature of things not only being the general laws of the universe, but also the specific hidden cryptic laws within yourself that determine your telos. What are you going to be striving towards? What's going to unfold within you? Who are you going to become in the future who you're not today? Only part of that comes from the nature around us. Part of it comes from the nature within us. The character. This is where we use the word character to try to distinguish the inner nature from the outer nature. It is what's, and we get this from storytelling and experience of hearing stories. We know when something is in character for Dr. McCoy versus in character for Spock. There are lines. Almost any of us can do an impersonation of either of them in a way that is easily distinguishable, that you most of the time would not confuse one for the other, because we have a sense of their character. And even though they're imaginary people, the purpose of these stories was to develop someone with enough character that they feel real to us, because we have through the medium of storytelling, we have experienced their nature enough that it makes sense to us now, and we know how to inhabit that nature. Just like we can learn the difference between inhabiting the nature of being a fisherman on a wide sea versus the nature of being a hunter creeping through a dark forest looking for berries. We have learned the nature of these ecosystems enough that even a small child can often do a passing impersonation of a fisherman versus someone looking quietly for berries in the forest. The nature of things, nature as normative, like Donald was talking about, normative in this sense of it has directions, it is creating possibilities. It's unreasonable to get angry with a tree because it won't uproot itself and walk somewhere else. There is a axiological issue at stake here. We're not just saying how things are, and we're not just saying what we know, but we're saying, when we talk about physis, we're saying that the intersection of ontology and epistemology suggests an axiology to us, right? That some things that we could do within our nature or the nature around us is going to be sustainable and healthy for us. And some things that we try to do within that nature are going to make us sick or kill us. And that, hey, if we're not persuaded by that, it's not the Greeks. The Greeks don't care. If we want to sicken ourselves and make ourselves weak and unable to deal with the world, then there's no point debating us. The easiest solution is to let us do it, and we remove ourselves from the gene pool. So the interesting people to talk to are the ones who are busy trying to master themselves enough, and who are coming from cultures that are healthy enough that their worldview and their value system is in harmony with their circumstances. This issue of harmonious versus not harmonious, this comes right out of the word physis. If there are hidden but potent forces at work driving things to transform, then what we notice is that we can imagine universes in which the forces could have been directly opposed and just annihilated everything. Why did it have to be like this? Why do we live in a world where the specific configuration of forces that are available and at work make it possible for life to emerge and sustain itself the way that it does? There are a whole range of possibilities, many of which are excluded, and we find ourselves left in a cosmos where the character of nature itself makes healthy things possible. They're not ruled out. Now, this isn't the same as a commandment that tells you precisely what to do like a puppet, but it's suggestive in the same way that discovering that everything in the cosmos is in the process of transformation, which requires us to rise up to the level of being able to study it and understand it and learn from it. In the same way, the moral imperatives of nature, like Donald alludes to, It doesn't come to us in the form of pre-digested aphorisms and commandments, but instead nature presents it to us as possibilities. And we can see possibilities that we think to ourselves, man, if I was to experience that, I would be a sad, sad person. I do not want to step off that cliff. I'm aware that the only thing preventing me from falling to my death is one more step. I have the will. I could do this, but I don't want to do that. I think it would hurt a lot, assuming I even survive. I would rather take a step back. Maybe I could pick some of those huckleberries and sit down and watch this beautiful view while I eat my lunch. We're required to, if we want to understand the axiology of nature from the ancient perspective, we're required to engage with life and engage our minds with thinking through consequences and maybe running some experiments, but trying to limit ourselves to the things that are most likely to maximize our outcomes. And this isn't the height of axiology. There are higher levels of moral philosophy than this, but as a foundation, it's not a bad start to say that instead of looking around you and saying none of this matters, which by the way is inclined to make you think, and neither do any of these animals or plants or people, only me, I'm the only thing that matters. And you go, the moment you start discounting the importance of the world around you, you're sort of on the road to destruction. Or you can look around yourself and say, my goodness, these things are all working very hard to sustain their lives. I mean, it's astonishing how much energy and work and intelligence goes into it. And maybe I'm going to move more cautiously through this and try not to be unnecessarily destructive and only do it where there seems to be an important trade-off at work. There are ways in which an engagement with phusis can cause one to develop as a moral being. And this was understood to the Greeks. They got this. This is built right, again, it comes right out of the core concept of phusis itself. What could the relationship of a human being possibly be to this realm? Gets you into thinking about, yeah, I'd rather not be eaten by the tiger, but I would like to eat those huckleberries. Phil, what's on your mind?
A very important point, Donald. But I wonder whether, let me start here. Like, the fact of the matter is human beings are differentiated from the rest of the beasts in a way, because we have a mind, whether that is because we ate the apple, as the Bible tells us, and that's why we're different, or whether that is like through hundreds of thousands of years, or certainly at least 7,000 years, we develop a certain kind of consciousness that is now wrapped up in a kind of human society and a culture. Whether the fact that even if we were to, I wouldn't say backtrack, but reinstitute a normative relationship, whether the meaning of normativity is anything like normativity back then, because we're not only shielded by the fact that our minds have evolved in relationship to that, but in relationship to culture and language and all the things that mediates. Normativity is going to be a different thing than it originally means, that we somehow had a sort of a slightly more natural relationship with nature. I think we have become estranged from nature, that we can't go back to that normativity. So we have to figure out something else out, because I guess it's a little bit like the Pandora's box, once it's out, once the atomic bomb is there, with Robert Oppenheimer. The funny thing is Robert Oppenheimer actually regretted the fact that he made the atomic bomb, but only afterwards, when you can't put it back in the box. Because even if he himself put it back in the box, everybody else knows. And so we have essentially become a species that at least an important part of our normativity is hoarding, right? I mean, it's become natural to us in a way, you know? In fact, it almost becomes unnatural if you're not hoarding. You know, it's like, what the hell's wrong with you? You know, like, as if you don't care about money or not. Are you out of your mind? You gotta be lying. In this culture, if you're not interested in money, at least to a certain degree, then you are lying. I once had a conversation with somebody, you know, about equality. And I said, you know, yes, I abhor the divergence between the really rich and the really poor. There's no question about that. It's abominable. But if you think about equality, you take it to the extreme, then you would say that, well, you might be living on $5 a day. I said, as compassionate as I might be, please don't tell me I'm going to live on $5 a day, because I'm not going to vote yes. I mean, there is a limit to my existence as well, right? So the fact of the matter is that most people are saying, oh yeah, I work on the assembly line, it's not fair. That's absolutely true. But have you think about the fact that, yeah, but you're still making a hell of a lot of money than somebody in Bangladesh. If they are lucky, they're making $2 a day, right? Are you willing to like actually get that person to even your level, let alone equality? Because that's what it would mean. That is part of the problem. I think we live in a society where I think we do have a fear that we will run out of stuff, and we all, to a certain degree, hoard a little bit. We just don't want to become excessive. So yeah, normativity becomes completely different because it's almost normal to hoard. Not that we should, but it is, because we know that we can't survive on $2 a day. Let's just face it. I don't think anybody in this audience can honestly tell me, oh yeah, I'm for living on $2 a day. I just don't believe you if that's true, if that's what you're saying. All right, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I live in Seattle, and it's very expensive here. And I, as the executive director for my nonprofit, I set wages for my staff, and part of what we do every year, I have an exercise I go through. It takes several days where I go through the MIT living wage calculator, which is based upon people actually finding out what it costs to buy the necessities of life each year in each location around the United States. And then they put the categories available to you, so you can say, well, if I'm a married with 2 children and I'm living in Little Rock, Arkansas, then if I don't have this much money, I literally can't afford to go on. I don't have enough. And we can characterize, well, what am I missing? Do I not have enough for daycare? Do I not have enough for transportation? And then we can contrast that with, well, what if I'm living in New York City and I'm single and all I need is a little studio or something? You know, how much was that cost? And, you know, you frequently discover it's more expensive for one person with no dependents to get a studio in New York City than for a family of 4 to get a decent place in Little Rock, Arkansas. You know, and you get into this stuff where it makes you start to question the whole concept of a minimum wage, because, you know, the idea that there's a single minimum that applies everywhere is insane. You know, it's you know, it really depends on your life circumstances and where exactly you are. And MIT updates that every year, and I augment it. So I'm keenly aware of what Phil's been talking about. You certainly can't survive on $2 a day in Seattle. You also can't survive on $2 an hour in Seattle. It's insane how much money you need in order to have the barest minimum housing in Seattle. But such is the nature of things. So you know, today I think what we're going to do is we're going to go through these 5 sections we've covered before, A through E, in 5 of these sessions. So today we're just going to try to get through A. Today we are just going to get through A. Next week we'll get through B, and 2 weeks after that we'll go through C, and so forth. So let's look in paragraph 3. He says, our very consciousness and thinking are organs for the order of nature, even when we foolishly suppose they are serving only our own abstracted purposes, by which he means our intentional purposes, that our mind is our servant doing what we want it to do. In actuality, we are discharging our own natural potential by them. Discharging our own natural potential by them. And core to this is another component of the ancient concept of phusis, of nature. And that is that everything that has a nature, its nature is not some kind of mechanism. It's not a computer or a program. It is instead a constellation of powers and energies that are going to discharge themselves. They're one way or another, that energy is going to be transformed from potential into actual energy. It's not just going to sit there. When we got kittens last year for the first time in many, many years. Our kitty Surya here is asleep on my lap, is 17 years old. And you get spoiled by older cats. You get used to them sleeping on your lap for hours at a time. But the moment you get kittens, you are reminded that right out of the mother's womb, kittens are full of potential energy that is just charged up to 11, demanding to come out. And when they're first born, they're blind and they can't really do much. They sort of crawl around, but they can sure howl. They can meep at the top of their lungs to try to, motivate their mother. But the stage where they become proficient at running around and jumping is a stage in which you're reminded of what it means when to the Greeks, that your character is this wellspring of charges that are going to discharge somehow. The kitten's will to act is naked in a way that the more sophisticated 17-year-old cat's will to act is more obscured, is subtler. And in that, we see something very close to a core insight about life, that living things, by having a nature, by having a telos, by having a character, they are to the best of their ability going to act out on their telos. That's what makes it a telos. That's what makes it a direction, that their character demands of them that they satisfy these inner urges one way or another. And sure, the actual circumstances can change exactly how these energies manifest. And anybody who hasn't spent time reading Freud's summary of Freud's list of defense mechanisms, is in for a treat. All he does in there is talk about how the energy can be manifested in different ways, such that it can be subtle to figure out that the energy is even present. So the displacement, projection, compartmentalization, there's all these tricks that the mind uses in order to adjust exactly how we manifest our energy. But it's an ancient Greek idea that one way or another, we're going to manifest that energy. So likewise, if you hike in the woods, in the mountains, you're going to see a limited number of species of trees, but you're going to see incredible numbers of them, and no two of them are the same. And sometimes it's hard to tell. You're walking along a slope and it's pretty smooth and even, and the trees all pretty much look like each other. You'd have to look closer to see the differences between them. But in other places, you can find where a tree fell over but didn't die. And then, so it's lying horizontally across, a gap, a cliff. And then from that point, it starts to curve back upwards again in this crazy shape that's left over from having been previously knocked over. Or you can find a seedling that took seed in the stump of an old tree, and now its roots are growing down into the tree and around the tree. Or you'll find a seedling on a huge rock cliff face where it's managed to get its roots into a crack in the cliff where there's moisture and minerals. And it's been at this for decades. And that seedling has grown into, you know, a tree suspended over thin air. It's just clawing, hanging on to this sheer rock surface. So all of these trees have the same telos. They're the same species. And they're even the same variations, the same subspecies, the same variants. They're probably even the same family, because they're in the same general region. You know, they're all the descendants of older generations of trees. They started out as seeds, growing into seedlings and so forth. But they've all manifested very differently because their circumstances are so different. So this is what makes, you know, the intrinsic truth of nature difficult for us, is that there's no guarantee that these inner drives are going to manifest the same way from one case to another. In fact, because of how the more alive we are, the more sensitive to our circumstances, given the enormous variety of circumstances possible in the cosmos, the odds that two of us are going to end up identical are basically zero. So it can be tricky to work out what the drive is underneath, because it manifests in so many different ways. But the fact that it will manifest one way or another, if it possibly can, even if that means it has to be the only living thing, you know, for a quarter of a mile of sheer rock, because it just managed to get in there, you know, it shows how charged nature is. And in this, when we say a sentence like that, to do it in the ancient Greek way, we have to mean it in both senses. How charged everything around us is with the, you know, you can hardly even say desire, but the need to express its inner character. But also how charged each thing's inner nature is, that it's going to engage in this struggle with the entire infinite universe around it in order to express itself. And I'll just, before I call on Phil, I'll just briefly add one third example, which is, you know, you can you can walk in a desert, you know, that is as barren as you can imagine. And yet the very first time the rains fall hard, for the first time maybe in decades, a whole carpet of flowers spreads across the desert in weeks, like an unbelievable tapestry of color, where previously everything was just the colors of the sand. And it's because those seeds, buried in the soil for decades, seemingly in a completely inhospitable environment, you know, the ones that survived the first shot they got, they were completely charged up to 11 to take that shot, no matter how implausible it seemed. This quality of nature is exactly the opposite of how we envision nature. We envision nature as this passive thing waiting for us to act upon it. It has no meaning. It has no truth. It's just a big machine waiting for people to impose their will on it. But when you actually study the nature itself, especially if you can do it with the eyes of the ancient worldview, you see what they saw. Countless examples of what they saw, which is that nature is the opposite of passivity. It is massively full of all this energy that it must discharge. So when people talk about Heraclitus as being the philosophy of change, this is a modern thing to say. It's missing this whole dimension that to the ancients would have been obvious. It's not just about change. It's about dynamism. It's about energy. And it's about massive, inconceivable amounts of energy wanting to express themselves in characteristic ways. There's a war. You know, Heraclitus wrote, "War is the father of all things." There is a war between each thing and the nature around it for who's gonna get control over what energies each thing expresses. I'm going to try to express my teleology, my character, as best I can, but at the same time, I'm being pushed and shoved by the nature around me, which is trying to push me as though I were passive. So again, agency and contingency, this tug of war between the active and the passive is within that is where we find the actual expression of fate. How do things end up? They end up as a result of this tug of war in all places and all times. Phil, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I want to talk about something that happened in another meeting a week ago this evening. It was a local meeting. The meeting was like, why are Americans' lives so hard? That was the title. And immediately it became a more of an economic, a financial situation. Okay. People start talking about, oh, like the jobs not there, and the unfairness of the system and the wages, and technology, all of that. Okay. And after like about half an hour, people essentially focusing on the same thing, I sort of raised my hand and I said, I'm going to say something that seemed like it's paradoxical to what you guys are saying. Not that I disagree with what you're saying, but that's only a part of it. And I say, in 1960, 61, my mother, and we were living in San Mateo, which is in the peninsula of the Bay Area, was making $2,100 a year, raising a family of 3 children and herself. So I want to acknowledge that we were very, very poor. Perhaps not the poorest of the poor, but we were definitely very, very poor, okay? Particularly living in the Bay Area. And so when I went to college, what struck me was that it was so different from high school because I ran into so many people, mostly the professors, who has such divergent interests, like people are into bugs, and people into music, people into history. I mean, and I just got so excited by the fact that people have such a passion for learning and focusing on something that I may or may not be interested, but I was interested in the fact that they were interested. And so that was very interesting to me. And I realized that that was kind of like my mission in a way in life. And I remember, I knew that I was going to be an artist, pretty much. I didn't know, but I was pretty sure I was going to go in that direction. And, after a year, I took, and I told you this part already, took one of those vocational interest tests just to check to see if I'm sort of right. But when I got the text back, it was incredibly accurate. The way they measured is like the type of people like you in terms of the interest, how you are like them and what you're actually going to go to. And I scored pretty much high in all of the arts. I was actually higher in music than I was in art. And the humanities, philosophy and literature and so forth. And sociology, sort of middling. And but then I looked at the ones I was low at. And anything that has anything to do with money, finance, accounting, anything of that sort, even things like being a dentist, because it was money. It's like, I just was not interested in. And I remember looking at it, I said, oh, yeah, this is very accurate. But I said, uh-oh. I said, this is going to be a problem, right? But instead of scaring me, what happened was I was going to keep that in the back of my mind, but it's not going to stop me from what I wanted to do. Now, that was absolutely the most foolish thing you could do if you were in that seminar then, saying how difficult life was. Because as I went, as I transferred to Berkeley, I saw that all of the Asians were in the professions, because they were consuming money, which is obviously first or second generation you should be, and maybe your third generation you could become an artist of sort, or whatever you're going to be. And I think I say, so many of you are so concerned with this, whether you're anti-capitalist or whatever it is, you are bound in the system. They got you, right? You just want a better position in that particular thing that has to do with the economy and money and all that. So stop quibbling about, oh, you should be paid like $2 more an hour and whatever, whatever it is, because you're just fighting within that system. You got to be able to step out of it. And I said, what drove me was, in spite of how poor I was, I told them, I was so interested in school that I was in for 10 years. And I actually left with a $10,000 debt. If you count it in today's money, that's in excess of $100,000. So there's people who are whining about owing so much money, but it was difficult, If I knew how difficult was it, I knew it was going to be difficult. I didn't know how difficult it was going to be. I might have backed off, but I was willing to take the chance. But I was also willing to know that, if it didn't work at all, I'll just back off and do something else, maybe something like commercial art or whatever. And not that, I'll just work at a grocery store and stock things. And so that's what was my backup plan. And I said, what I was interested in is not how to teach me to make more money, but to become a human being, to learn, to understand, to feel how the world is. And that's part of the problem of our educational system, is that, in a sense, it's sort of molding you to be a productive worker to the system, and actually not even efficiently, so you don't know anything about money. At least if they're going to do that, they should teach everybody, this is how you manage money and so forth, right? So that you can remain at the bottom of the thing and always being struggle until you will work harder and all that, and is really productive. And you forgot how to be a human being. And that's the most fundamental thing that you should worry about, is how you could become a human being, in spite of the fact of a very difficult situation. And I think some people agreed with me afterwards, in spite of it, but they mostly still went back to the economy and all that, which is, I understand their concern. They're concerned partly because they're already trapped in the system. You can only work within the system. So I think that's part of the problem. That's why I mean, like, the social structure creates a web of constraint, and you think this is normal, but it is not normal. That's why I mean, normality may not have the same meaning as back in the days of the Greek. You are now in a bondage.
Yeah.
And you do not know this, right? I certainly did not know this to the degree that I know it now, but somehow I sensed that that was not what it. And I think to myself, well, but how did I came to make this choice? Because this is the most irrational choice I could have made if I was thinking, I got to survive. I think it has to do with the fact that I was Chinese, not like the other Chinese. I was Chinese because I always admired the arts and the literati, who were striving for knowledge and excellence. And that's part of the thing too. That's why I didn't go directly into art. In fact, I invented my own major, which is fine arts. In other words, art, and then some music and some theater and things of that sort. And, together with some humanities, philosophy, but quite a lot of it. And so I think that is actually not even the professional artists in our country, right? Because they just see art itself as a channel, rather than the fact that actually it's part of the whole humanities in a funny way. So,
Right.
so I got into a lot of trouble because by the time I was going into graduate school, I had not completed enough art courses to actually qualify and in terms of the skills as well. So, you know, your most fundamental thing is to be a human being. And that's the most important thing. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, being a human being, it's difficult, I think, would be the Greek perspective, which as we'll explore. Stephen, what's on your mind?
I often argue with people about the relevance of the UN articles. You know, people worship them as a religious. It's become the secular Bible. They're all bowing down and worshipping these ideas, and an outcome of socialism seems to have originated in Christianity. In Christianity, even the most lowly individual, and Nietzsche noticed this, even the most lowly individual has a significance. But if you look at nature, I mean, if the UN was going to make rules for sperms, it would say every sperm has to have an egg. Nature doesn't work that way. Sorry, guys. I know you keep on preaching the UN Bible at me, but nature doesn't operate on that principle. Nature operates on a principle completely at odds with UN principles. Thank you.
Yeah, it's sort of shocking in a forest when you study the release of seeds by trees. It's a fountain of seeds, most of which die. It's just nature's way of doing things. I think some of the conversations you're talking about relating to the UN must be an Australian thing, because in the United States they barely teach that the UN exists, let alone what any of its articles are. I ran some experiments, and most Americans don't even know there's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They couldn't list a single one that's in there. So we're sort of at the far end of the pole from what you're describing. The U.S. has just this incredible contempt for the UN, and I don't think I would trust any American, including myself, to say what the UN would say about the Monty Python and the meaning of life proposition that every sperm is sacred. We're the least qualified in the U.S. to know what the UN might possibly say about that. So energies. It's not just a war of energies, despite his use of the metaphor war, Heraclitus, but it's a system of energies in which they're harnessed together. And it's one of the most important fragments in all of Heraclitus, but one which you can only understand if you've read and understood a lot of his other fragments, is this one. People who do not understand how that which is at variance with itself agrees with itself. So at variance with itself, he's talking about war, right? He's talking about conflict. He uses the terms war and conflict elsewhere for this, to be at variance with itself. But he's setting a paradox, which looks like a direct contradiction, which is that things that are at war with themselves in nature, in the realm of nature, it is in the nature of nature that things are at war, not only with other things, but even within themselves. But that war takes the form of a harmony. That it both is and is not a war. It's a discord and a harmony at the same time. There's another Heraclitus quote where, where is it? Discord. Let me give this a second to search. There it is. Fragment 98. Opposition brings discord. Out of discord comes the fairest harmony. So when he's talking about variance with itself and agreeing with itself, he's talking about discord and harmony. And because in the very next sentence, he picks up harmony as a term again. It says there is a harmony in the bending back. The bending back. Palintropos, or what we might in English call palintropy. which is a word we need, but we don't have it for this purpose. And palintropy is when opposing forces are bent back upon themselves, so that rather than fighting themselves destructively, they resist each other constructively to create a harmony. And he uses the metaphor of, the bow and the lyre, both of which are examples of two forces in opposition, the force of the string in opposition against the wood. And yet the result is the creation of music. So he's using this, he refers to the bow elsewhere, he refers to the lyre elsewhere. He comes back to these themes over and over, but clearly, Wheelwright would argue clearly, and so would Kenneth Smith and I, if you read enough of Heraclitus and you put it all together, what you see is that he's saying that this is the nature of phusis. It's not just changing, it's not just othering, it's not just flowing, it's certainly not just what moderns think it is, just some passive mechanism out there waiting for us to push the buttons and pull the levers. It's a system of dynamic energies that have been harnessed together into a constructive, sustainable, even regenerative format. It's like my friend Tom Munneke says about the toaster and the cat. If you dent the toaster stays dented forever unless somebody acts on it to fix it. The toaster at no level within the toaster knows that it is a toaster, neither consciously nor unconsciously. It is very easy to turn a toaster into an untoaster. But it's not so easy to turn a cat into an uncat, because if a cat stubs its toe or gets a cut, it's going to heal. And if something comes at a cat that the cat has time to respond to that would damage the cat will get out of the way and won't even allow the damage in the first place. The cat has, and again, English words are going to fail us here, it has a drive to be the cat. All of the cells in the cat's body, in an unconscious genetic way, know that they're cat cells. And they know where they're supposed to be. And if there's damage, they know where something is missing. And they want to fill it back in again and remake the whole cat. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. But it's a natural consequence of the way that cats come into being, starting as a fertilized cell that creates generations of differentiated daughter cells, unfolding order over and over and over until eventually it's a cat. This is a cell that knows how to make itself into a cat. So it follows that during its life as a cat, it still knows how to make itself into a cat, which gives it the capacity to heal itself to some extent. Of course, this is the most spectacular in salamanders and other animals that can regenerate whole limbs. But this will to be what you are, to express your inner character, is present in all living things to some degree or another. We see it. I mean, evidence is everywhere. Literally everywhere we turn in a living world, we can't look at something that doesn't have the will to express its inner character. And
this was the cause Nietzsche took up.
Yes. Nietzsche cares about this a great deal. Nietzsche, and I'm sure Kenneth Smith gets a lot of this from Nietzsche. Nietzsche is a great lens system for looking at the ancients. Not because he's always 100% accurate, but because he's so enthusiastic about it. And he's a stylist. So when he sees things in the Greeks that excite him, he can put it into new language and act as a translator of the ancient worldview to moderns. Now, in the course of that, you have to put up with his personality, which is that he's enthusiastic. And there's going to be some laughing, there's going to be some sneering, there's going to be name calling and pointing, but there's going to be some celebration too. He wants you to get what's so cool in the Greeks that he's discovered there. And this very thing, like Stephen points out, this very thing is one of the qualities that Nietzsche sees, in the Greek view of the world. That the Greeks can see what we, as moderns, are ideologically programmed not to notice, which is that none of these living things are passive. The most passive living thing in the world you can imagine still has a will to become what it is, to unfold, not just to stay what it is in a static sense like a rock, but to recreate itself If its blood pressure gets too high, if its blood pressure gets too low, blood sugar gets too high, blood sugar gets too low. Any of these variations, or many of the countless other variations involved in living systems, occur, and that living thing is going to try to recreate, is going to try to adjust its circumstances to recreate the health-giving, life-giving circumstances that it needs in order to be what it is. And at the exact same time that it's doing that, as the Greeks build right into the word physis, it's also becoming something else. Every cat is the kitten grown up. It has become, and it's still on an arc of becoming. So for the Greeks, this idea of life as an organism, and that organisms, we're going to come back to this in section C, form and matter, but it's being implied and talked about here. There is so much energy within living systems, within nature, to make them what they are, that they not only can for a certain amount of time recreate themselves and keep themselves being what they are, but they can reproduce, first of all, which is astonishing. You can see why people made mystery religions about reproduction. But also, at the exact same time, each thing is also on its own arc of transformation. Whether it's in a chrysalis or not in a chrysalis, effectively, we are all pupae in the course of ceasing to be something previous and beginning to become something new. And that for the Greeks, not the idea of a thing, but this potent idea of a transformative, metamorphosing, teleological system of energies that is an organism. This is their fundamental metaphor. We look at a cat and see a thing because we're predisposed to see things. We see a cat sitting next to a toaster and we see two things. But the Greeks were inclined to go the opposite direction and look at everything as an organism. They might look at a cat and a toaster and see two organisms. And they'll certainly do the same thing if they look at the human mind. They're not going to see the human mind as a computer running software. They're going to see it as an organism with its own character that's trying to become what it is at the same time that it's trying to become something new. And they're going to do the same thing about all the abstract concepts we can think of. They're going to do that about math and logic. They're going to do that about laws, a city. Everything looks like an organism to them. See, when we first start talking about nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth, it sounds like we're stretching. I mean, how could the ancients really do that? I mean, it's a stretch for us to see nature as becoming or as intrinsic truth, let alone both of them. And the idea that there's axiology there, that there's moral imperative in it, that also, it just starts to seem like a real stretch. But once you get this idea that nothing looks like a thing to them, that's us. That's what it means to be modern. But to an ancient, everything looks like an organism. It's all growing and transforming. It's all determined to unfold its potential, discharge its potential. Then it starts to become easy to see why, to the ancients, nature would be becoming, nature would be intrinsic truth, and nature would be this realm of stories that can teach us about morality and axiology. Because we are not at all surprised to find such complexity, in, for example, embryogenesis. Or for those who study evolution, you can see, how does the primordial slime arise to become the noble thinker? We can imagine the unfolding of complexity over time, even if we don't quite understand it. So if instead of those things being treated as weird aberrations that are exceptions to our rule that everything's just a thing, if instead we looked at a world in which everything was an organism, then the rest of this follows quite naturally. And we can see how it is that by standing in a slightly different perspective, an ancient and a modern can both look at the same thing and see two completely different things. For one thing, we see a thing and they see an organism. Joseph, then Stephen, then Phil. Go ahead, Joseph. Tell us what's on your mind.
I was just going to say, this idea of harmony, it's equally important on just a personal level. And that's what I think sometimes individuals try to, I think of people that sometimes continually resist reality in certain circumstances, and try and conquer it, to be quite honest. And that that makes it very hard to adjust to circumstances. That makes it hard to accept circumstances. That makes it hard to even transform, and maybe if not impossible. And what I mean about this, in particular, is that in the sense that if you look at something and you don't necessarily accept it for what it is, then all of a sudden you're pushing up against whatever that is, and that could be as simple as something like the cycles of death, to be an example. If you don't accept that for what it is, and that's just the way nature works, then you're going to have a real problem in adapting and adjusting. And that's just, that's one example of the way, because, sometimes, we can get attached to people, and, naturally so, but they're not going to be here forever, and that's just the way it is. But that's in every aspect of our life. And that's just one small example where, and this gets to the idea of being able to detach from outcomes as well. And all of that is rooted in the natural order of things, because there's a limited amount that you can control. And that comes back to my point about the whole thing of trying to dominate something, trying to conquer something. Sometimes I hear, oftentimes it's individuals that tend to be Silicon Valley libertarians, think that they have to conquer nature. And I don't mean to call them out, and whatever, it is what it is. And they talk about it. They need to break things, and they need to conquer nature. And in a way, that seems to me is just as just the exact opposite of what we actually need in order to have any kind of tranquility in our own lives. So I think that's a very dangerous attitude to have. And in that particular instance, I know Stephen talks about the idea that all the time, how man is a god. I think that that's an example of that, where nature is something to be conquered. And so that's just a thought. It's not only in harmony, not only in an economic way, where you could look at it, things being regenerative, but it also is in a way of for our own personal tranquility. Anyway, sorry, I'm doing a couple things at once here.
It's all right. It's good stuff, Joseph. Thank you. I think about those towns in Japan that are built on the slopes of a volcano, where they decide to erect massive earthworks so that when the volcano goes off, its lava can be channeled in a direction that doesn't destroy the town. They don't try to plug the volcano and make it impossible to erupt. They know that's not going to work. They're stronger than we are. That volcano is going to erupt. And they try not to live their life in a fantasy of let's just not think about it. Where if God really loved me, he wouldn't let this happen. They try to avoid all of that, and they try to just say, well, we would rather not burn to death in lava, but we're living on a volcano. So, you know, how are we going to resolve this conflict? We got to resolve it by coming up with a harmony. And the harmony is when the lava flows, wouldn't it be great if it flowed over there instead of over here? You know, they're trying to think through rather than dominate. They're trying to harmonize with their circumstances. And so you can sort of see that, what a different approach that is from like in the US. I don't know if that's ever been done on any single volcano in the United States ever. And it's not even that unusual thing to happen in Japan. It's just a very different way of looking at the world from what's normal to us. I keep coming back to this word normal, but we'll have to tackle that another time. Did you have something you wanted to add, Joseph? I saw you came off mute.
Yeah, I was just going to say the other thing is it's that, you know, it's a demand that the world must be a certain way, and that's where kind of the world just does not work like that.
Yeah,
and so, you know, that's what it might really mean. And anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, and you know what we're going to see in these sections ahead, which, you know, granted we went through over the last year and a half, but we're going to do it fast now, one per week. And what we're going to see in these sections ahead is the way in which directly flowing out of this are novel interpretations of the relationship between, you know, choice and fate, free will and determinism. That you know, the extent to which we are determined to dominate tends to make us less free. And the extent to which we recognize that we can push for certain outcomes, but we can't know in advance exactly what's going to be the result of our efforts. Now, this is perhaps a healthier relationship to the struggle between our inner nature and the nature that's around us. And for the Greeks, that was just taken for granted. It's built right into their language. It's the normal way they saw the world, was this tug of war between agency and contingency. Whereas, you know, you listen to science films recorded in the 1950s and 1960s. I don't know what it's like for people going through elementary school today, but when we were kids, they used to periodically pop on these little films, science and education films from the 50s and 60s, you know, and you know, they'd be there talking about, you know, the miracle of chemistry, or, you know, simple machines and how they work, you know, and the confidence and the we are growing to become masters of the universe, the conquest of space. You know, you see this in science fiction films too. These phrases just trip off the tongue as being core to the worldview of the middle 20th century. We were sure that, you know, we were just going to learn more and more and become more and more powerful until finally everything would go the way we wanted it to. Because with power, surely there are no unintended consequences. Surely everything works out exactly the way we want it to. It's astonishing when you see the level of sophistication that the Greeks have in their tragedies about the understanding of how fraught with peril power and willfulness are. And then you compare that to the mid 20th century optimism that, you know, we'll be like gods soon and be able to do anything we want. And you're just like, what has happened here? How can we have lost so much nuance in our understanding about who we are in the world and what is and is not within our power? So thanks for bringing that up. Stephen, then Phil, then Sharon. Go ahead, Stephen. What's on your mind?
Probably getting back to the idea that is the human individual an end in themselves? Now, this is an essential teaching of Christianity, that no matter how lowly you are an end in yourself. And if the world can't complete you, don't worry, just come up to heaven and God will give you completion. And they had them all fooled for 2,000 years. But that's not the way reality works. And this is a struggle between idealism and reality. Whitehead, I was looking at Whitehead, and he's very critical of Kant, because Kant set us on a path where we became very idealistic, to the point where we've exiled realism out of the picture. And that's a question. Am I, as a human individual, an end in myself? Which was the perspective that preoccupied me as a child. When I was learning, crawling around, I am an end in myself. But I start to look at myself and really, I have these ambitions, but are they really me? It's like sexual desire. To a 17-year-old, that is me. That is an end in myself. And then you get older and you think, am I being fooled by something within me? Am I being sucked in? How much of what I see in life, this was the picture I wanted to pursue in life. Have this, have that. That's the good life. But is that really me, or am I being sucked in? And this is difficult because this is what Nietzsche is warning about. Once we threw away the book, as Faust did, threw away the guidebook, we're on a path where we're going to have to battle with nihilism. But everyone's content. There's no problem. No worries, guys. We've gotten rid of Christianity. Don't worry. Man is inherently good. Don't worry. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, in you're foreshadowing what I was going to do next, which I won't explore, but I'll at least share in the chat. But I mean, building on this argument about phusis and the nature of phusis to the ancient Greeks, he then draws in Nietzsche and shows how the reason that Nietzsche is so eager to make judgments about people is that it was normal to the ancients to judge the maker by what they make, to judge the doer by the deed, and to judge the tree by the fruit. If it's producing pears, it's probably a pear tree, and it could tell you till the cows come home that it's a rose bush, but it isn't producing any roses. It just seems to be producing pears. And this is the human condition in which people are frequently unaware of who or what they are. But you can look at the signature of how the potential within them has discharged and say, in order to have done these things, you must have this character or one of these characters off of a group. But there's certain characters that could not have done the thing that you just did. To have done that, you must be something specific. And this violates one of the core tenets of moderns, which is that we're infinitely free, and at all times we can be anybody we want to, which means we're unknowable. We believe it's a tenet of our freedom that each of us is just an unknowable, inscrutable will, capable of doing anything at any moment. And in this, we're trying to emulate the God of Genesis, who could create the entire cosmos out of nothing on a moment's notice, or at least in 7 days or 6 days. And the ancient perspective is quite the opposite, which is that the energies within us are organized into a system. That system does leave fingerprints, and that you not only can, but it is your duty to evaluate, whether you do a good job or a bad job of evaluation. You have to try to evaluate the character of the doer that created this deed. And part of the reason is that's what we do every day when we get up. And if we go to the fridge and go in and reach for the food, it's because we have judged what we're going to find within it. And it is no more an act of hubris to do that than it is an act of hubris to try to do the same thing with another human being, because we have the same problem, which is we need to know where we are. We need to know what our liabilities are, what's at risk, what our opportunities are. If we don't know those things, then we're walking in a dreamland. And so as a result, judging, even if we're going to do it imperfectly because we're mortal, but judging, rather than being a forbidden action that nobody's supposed to do, or an impossible action because we're all supposedly infinitely free, It's actually something that we do all the time, every day, and we're better off just admitting that we're doing it and trying to get good at it than trying to deny that we're doing it, or trying to pretend that it's a sin of some kind. There's a world of difference between judging people unto hell versus judging that somebody's probably not a very good speller because, did you read that essay? I read that essay. Or judging that I guess they've been watching too much of some TV show because of the metaphors they're using. We are constantly trying to evaluate the character of the people around us through their actions. Phil, and then Sharon. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, to me, it seems like the problem of modernity is, matter of fact, the problem of civilization is the rise of the instrumental mind. And instead of going back to Greece, I really pinpointed in Egypt, in the myth of Osiris and Seth, his brother. Osiris was the god of the living body, and Seth was, I guess, the god of measurements. And of course, Osiris was the ruling figure on earth, and Seth was probably envious and ended up capturing him and locking up in this coffin and threw him into the river. And it was not successful because Isis, which is Osiris's wife, was able to find him and brought him back. And Seth instead now cut up his body and threw it into the river. And Isis could only found most of the body, but did not find the phallus. This is the reproductive organ. So she has to fashion the phallus out of wood. And I don't know how it came about that. I guess the power of his body was he was able to produce Horus. But that division between the living body of the let's call it the mystic mind, and then instrumental mind, really started there. Then I began to wonder, like, oh yeah, why is it that eventually, even though Osiris ruled the underworld, Isis actually produced the external rule of civilization and measurement and building has become the productive thing that we have. And I have a feeling it's because it's just a hell of a lot easier to manifest a civilization through instrumentation than to the mystic mind. And then you wonder, like, well, was that really the beginning? And I think not. I've always thought tracing it back to splitting the stone was the moment. Because probably by accident it happened, you hit a stone and flint or whatever it is, and it broke off and there's a sharp edge. It's, oh yeah, there's something we could do with that. I guess you could have made it into jewelry of some sort, but and I don't blame them for doing it, because at that time, like human beings were rather vulnerable, right? And you needed an instrument to protect yourself, because nature was, in a singular sense, an enemy. When the lion comes, you're not going to argue with it. Oh, look, let's be fair. That's not going to happen. And so I think the beginning of that is just that it was a necessity. And once you start and you realize, this stone could be a utility, could be part of the equipment of things, then I think that's the beginning of it. And I think it went further back than that. From what perceptual psychologist tells us, that of all our five senses, there may be more, but the five basic senses, apparently 90% of our contact with the world is through our eyes, which means the other four only have 10% left in terms of its direct contact with the world. So the eyes had the function in a world in which you have to objectify it. Because look, if the world was like a world, just you're living through a world of sound, I guess you would develop like a bat and develop sonar or something. But it would be hard to manage in a world of survival because things are not clear. It's like super impressionism. It's not even impressionism. And so objectification seems to be a fundamental part of our understanding because it began there. I remember talking to the dean that was going to hire me at Youngstown, and he asked me, what's the difference between art and music? I guess hoping to get me involved with something. I gave him a pretty important answer. I said, the problem with art is that it has a tendency to be functional and objectify the world. And in order to really do art, you have to actually deconstruct the objectification in order to get into the real dimension of this mystic world, if you want to put it that way. And where music is, right from the beginning, it has enough clarity to distinguish harmony, but on the other hand, it remains mystic and flows directly without the mediation of objectification in that sense. And so I think the fact that objectification becomes so fundamental to us, it's hard to give it up. That the world is actually made of things. I still believe that, and so therefore you want to create a representation that there are things, but there's a deeper part, which you call the harmony, in which you sort of background that. And I think that's part of the reason why we are trapped in this sort of like, I guess you want to call the Bible story. We ate from the instrumental tree, but we did not eat from the tree of life. Or at least we left the garden and we forgot about it. And I think maybe that's where the problem is, because I would think it would be hard. Well, I think we kind of do that to a certain degree, but it would be hard to build an entire civilization out of just like a kind of grand orchestra of music, organizing city planning, all of that, air traffic, and all of that. It just, so I think we have become so dependent on objectification that we can't let it go. We're hanging on to the cliff for dear life, because if we let that go, we'll surely fall into our death. And so I think that's the problem. By tracing it back, it began with splitting the stone because it was convenient, it was very helpful. And then instrumentation took over and objectification became so fundamental to us that we can't give it up. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Sharon, what's on your mind?
So I have a comment. Gentlemen and ladies, we decided to go from section A again as a revision with the intent of going through this very rapidly. Knowing us, I have questions about that.
Yeah,
but
sure.
what I noticed during this entire discussion is that we ended up almost in the section which follows mythos and logos about character and class and
Yes.
man and his nature and where we're going,
Yes.
right? So therefore, I mean, I don't know if this decision was a democratic one or it was just taken unilaterally. I am just saying that this whole Kenneth Smith series of essays, and I've read ahead in a lot of them, are so interesting that going over the sections, you'll get a different perspective every time because it's so rich.
Yes. Yes.
And so I don't know if this is effective or efficient utilization of the time. And so therefore, am I objective? Yes, I am.
You'd like to move on.
Correct.
Okay.
I've said my piece.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. It was a request to go back and skim the previous sections
But
again.
we don't skim. We are an in-depth, and Donald gives us very, very rich. I mean, Phil, not Donald. Phil gives us very, very rich dialogue about everything. And skimming is almost impossible.
Sure. So I'm perfectly happy to, instead of focusing on, a series of weeks back to back in which we go A, B, C, D, E, saying, okay, we went back and did A, and that was a useful retrospective. Now we'll pick up where we left off again and try to finish up F and move on to G. And
thank you.
If at some point later on, people are like, can we go back and redo B again? Then we could take 1 week and redo B, but it won't be like blocking us from making progress.
Well, here's my comment on that. If you want to redo B as an individual, then I think you should read it and come with questions and comments and have us discuss it. And I'm sorry, because
Let's do that.
These essays are so rich, and probably because I'm such a novice and a neophyte that I am feeling I want to go.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's do it. Let's pick up with F again next week.
Thank you. Sorry, guys, I don't mean to be objectionable, but I listened and listened and listened because I really wanted to see what I was missing.
Yeah. That's good. All right. So we have 8 more minutes to wrap up for today.
Thank you for hearing me out. Thank you.
No, it's fine. Let's do that. Stephen, you got your hand up. What's up?
No, I was just going to say, for me, I'll be going over this quite a lot, maybe 80 years before I start to get it. Thank you.
Yeah, it's like what Sharon was saying. They're really rich. There's a lot of material to be pulled out of it. So yeah, I like the idea that if someone wants us to go back and do B or C or D, they have to come armed with questions, and then we can use those questions in combination with that section to see if we
So
can.
the discussion now becomes focused.
Yes. Yes.
And inquiring instead of meandering.
Yeah, I like it. I like it.
I hope I'm not too objectionable, but this is how I am.
Well, I like you, Sharon.
You don't direct operating rooms for 30 or 40 years and not lead the band.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Oh,
Donald, you got your hand up. What's on your mind?
This quote from Nietzsche, I would just say, people interested in section A, read the quote from Nietzsche in paragraph 3 like 100 times. Write it on the blackboard, do whatever. It's one of the most phenomenal things ever written. And it's, ad hominem, we talked about this when we did it. Ad hominem is a vicious form of invalid argument in modernity. But Nietzsche really says how to do it. If you want to do it, it's not, you're an SOB. It's you have these ends, you have these, you've shown these desires and wants from which we can see this part of your character. You have made these choices, behave in this way from which we see your character. And you can reflexively apply this to yourself as part of Genothe se auton. I can look at my own behaviors and see how my own mind works. And anyway, good. You can, you know, you really want to study that paragraph. You don't need to read all of it. You can get through it fairly quickly.
So Donald, I do get ad hominem. I do get it. But I think in forums like this, when you think differently from the rest of the gang, the only way to entertain the discussion and thereby impact the process is to bring it out.
Oh,
And
I have no problem with your wanting to go on. Believe me, that's not why I do.
Okay.
My calling attention to this is that finally, after talking a lot, I think this is one of the best things in the section, if not the paper. The connoissorial ad hominem. You know, it's really, it's just something that I liked when we read this section the first time, you know.
Yes.
And if you look at my copy of this document, you can hardly read what's typewritten because I've written so much stuff on top of it.
I was just about to say, I've written a lot of that, and probably it's based on your comments. I have lots of notes too on this.
Yeah, I sort of understand Sharon's objection, because
It's not an objection, it's a suggestion.
no, the tension is between going on and going on and on and on and on.
Well,
So I understand it.
That's right.
well,
Nice.
you know, this whole thing is circular. You know, we can drop in any place and go either forwards or backwards from there.
Circular.
Yeah, and get you know, it's part of like, well, it's like, I think maybe Kenneth got it. It's a sort of homage to Hegel. That all of it is one thing, and you have to get the whole. And ultimately, because it's a big circle or maybe a sphere, where you start and where you wander through it makes little difference in the end, providing you do kind of get through it. So I'm all in. We can move on. We could do anything. I've got gigabytes of Kenneth Smith stuff on my hard drive on my computer that I've read over. We'll see. I started getting things from him 50 years ago, where he would just send stuff out to people he knew, to former students. We can read this any way you want. I'm just glad that we read it at all.
So I have a question, and I notice in my reading, Kenneth refers to prior content. And sometimes I have to go back and read it. That's another reason why I'm saying, let's go on, because Kenneth, he doesn't write repetitively, but their philosophy is so rich and so many people opine on it that when Kenneth puts forward the different opinions, it's almost like a reference to look back and see what he said.
His arguments are very interconnected.
That's the word I like, interconnected. Thank you very much.
And You know, and if I
Yes.
wanted this, if I was going to tell you where to start with Kenneth, I would say learn Greek, then learn German, read Heraclitus, Aristotle, and whatever, then move on and read all of Hegel. And then when you've got the preliminaries done, start with his stuff. You know, but I don't know how. I don't know how you do it. I did study Greek. I did study German. That was a long time ago, and my language skills are greatly diminished, but there's still enough that as you read this, you say, oh, Kenneth's referring to the Greek here. It's the English word, but it's the Greek, or it's German, but that's the word that the Germans use to translate the Greek. I don't read. If you read and enjoy this, Sharon, great. More power to you.
I do, because I have an embryonic brain, a developing philosophical brain, which Rick has really helped mature over these 65 weeks. And so, as I said before, you go back and read those passages. It's so rich, you bring out another perspective. Let's move on.
And you can do this, you know, had you started this when you were younger, you would have arrived in the same place. You would have just gone over it more times and thought of it. I still think things, and I'll look at them and I'll say, wow, I never saw this meaning in that sentence before. I just missed it, or
So
what wasn't paid. You know, and I don't think of myself as, I have familiarity with what Kenneth Smith writes. I'm not, and I was his student, but I'm not like a Smithian or anything like that. I read this for pleasure because it makes me think. You know, and so it looks to me like you're doing everything right, Sharon. And yeah,
Okay.
let's move on. There's no like, let's don't move on from section A until we fully understood everything that Kenneth is saying in section A.
Because it'll never happen.
And
Right.
yeah, you're
We'll go to F.
you know, so because you couldn't understand A unless you'd read all the other stuff. But there's not even just end times. End times depends on, I don't, I've got some other stuff I read occasionally of his that aren't end times, but they're where he discusses Greek terms, where he discusses other parts of history. I've got one where he's got a little preface on it that I keep. It says, this is primarily written to correct Donald's misunderstanding of Plato and how he's clung to it for decades.
Now I want to read that.
You see,
That one I could probably send you.
So Rick, can I have one more comment, please?
Yeah.
So in my silence, I heard Phil say that he was at a discussion as, why do Americans have life so hard? Right? I heard him come up with that premise. And I want to say one thing, and I've traveled extensively. The people at the bottom of the ladder in America are the richest poor people in the world. And that's all I'm going to say.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, why don't we see what Stephen and Phil have in mind, and then we can wrap up for today. And next week,
And thank you for accommodating me, all of you. Thank you very much.
Of course. That's what we're here for, is to accommodate each other and learn together. So, and as Donald said, it doesn't matter where we pick up we might as well keep moving forward because that's as good a place as any other place. So let's do that. Stephen, what's on your mind?
Well, looking at the historical epochs, we're dealing with the Greek pagans, and it was a sort of a rich unfoldment, because at the end of it, we come to the Dark Ages, which was a bottleneck. And very little of what was unfolded survived to get through to the other side. Well, they were all happy because they now had the all-powerful God on their side. They had established the kingdom of the all-powerful God. But there's a problem, those Christian monks would have been thinking back, hey, those Greek pagans are so much smarter than us. This can't be right. And so we're on page 4, we're dealing with what the pagan Greeks were. And the next page, we're moving into the Christian Middle Ages, which was a collapse of what had been the high point of Greek culture. I mean, we don't see a Greek Republic or a Roman Senate anymore. We just see an Oriental potentate. The late Roman Empire turned into China. It changed into what the Orient was, this peculiar Occidental quality sort of almost vanished. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phil, what's on your mind?
My comment would probably be pretty short. I see the reading more like a field of dewdrops. Yeah, and that's why I love the haiku, because when you look at a haiku, you're looking at a dewdrop, and somehow by looking at it carefully from different angles, it at least metaphorically seems to manifest the entire world. And so I don't mind looking at things very carefully, because each time it looks different. And it also reminds you, once you look at it and have that understanding that it's somehow connected, then you actually begin to see the rest of the world slightly differently. But it doesn't matter if you have that state of mind where you enter the text or where you see the dewdrop. You just have to have the patience to look at things carefully, which contradicts the rapid pace that we are forced to live in which everything has to be done in a soundbite. So I think moving on, staying here, it doesn't matter because we're going to be doing the same thing and looking at it and how it reflects the rest of the world.
So your game either way. Yay. Well, on that note, let's wrap up for this week. And next week, we'll pick up where we left off in the middle of section F. And the week after, I'm off again. It'll be the week for next round of chemo.
And for all those that want to save chat now.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Save